Today's webinar presentation is titled Exploring Silvicultural Strategies in New England, Oak. Our presenter today is Dr. Mark Ashton. Mark earned a PhD in silviculture and Masters of Forestry from Yale University. He is the Morris K. Jessup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology, the Director of the School of Forests, and the Principal Investigator for the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University. Mark has conducted over 35 years of research on biological and physical processes governing the dynamics of natural forests and the creation of their agroforestry analogs. In particular, he has studied the rich genera of the temperate oak hickory forests of southern New England and compared them to the forests of Sri Lanka and the seasonal rainforests of Panama. He is the author of over 150 peer-reviewed journals, an author of 2 field guides, an author of a silvicultural textbook used throughout North America, and the editor or author of 12 other publications concerning the management of forests for a variety of social values. Suffice it to say that we are fortunate to have him joining us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Ashton. And Mark, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for attending on this nice winter's day. I guess up in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine you all have a lot of snow, but down here in sunny southern New England on the coast we have just a scattering. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about some of the advances we've made, some of the silvicultural research that we've been doing, the ecological research we've been doing here in southern New England around these second growth oak hickory forests, and in particular the work we've been doing at the Yale Myers Forest in northeastern Connecticut, which really represents sort of a very wide physiographic province on the eastern side of the Connecticut River, from sort of central Massachusetts, central New England, south all the way to the coast, Long Island Sound. But I think many of the results that we have are applicable to some of the drier site oak forests that you have in sort of central and southern New Hampshire and Vermont, and in the northern hardwood, some of the sunnier aspects, drier aspects of the northern hardwood forest that one has to the west of the Connecticut River Valley. So what do we have? What do we know about these kinds of forests? Well, they have, in general, sort of a common history of land clearance. A lot of these oak hardwood forests, these oak hickory forests, if you go further south where we are, we have a lot more hickory than further north. All these forests were cleared, particularly to the east of the Connecticut River Valley during the colonization period, sort of during the 1700 period. And that clearance was for agriculture. So they were really physically cleared and went primarily to pasture. Now that's a different land use history when you think about some of the northern New England forests where oak might be prevalent, or some of the Berkshire or forests to the west of the Connecticut River Valley, where lands, a lot of those lands were heavily cut over, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, sort of the 1820s onwards. So it's a little bit of a difference. So the forests that I'm talking about in terms of common land use history are primarily those like Yale Myers in northeastern Connecticut, ones which have had an agricultural history. That's how oak came back. It came back from old field pine beneath this history of pasture. It's very strongly, has a very strong ability to coppice. It is very prone to deer browse, but at that time, particularly during land abandonment in the 1850s, when people, particularly in southern New England, were moving off the landscape to work in the factories of the new industrializing southern New England region, particularly up and down the Connecticut River Valley, people were moving off the landscape. That means that they weren't working the landscape. They might be still there, They might be still in their original farmhouses, or their parents in the original farmhouses. But they weren't actually manipulating, working the land. But deer hunting, anything that moved was still eaten. Deer populations were really low at that time. And the small oak regeneration that was coming in because it's tolerant of fire. People would try and maintain or clear the land in a relatively sort of lethargic way, in an easy way, by just lighting a match and watching things go. That sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. But as you can imagine, it used to be a fairly frequent occurrence of just trying to maintain and clear the brush back from around the houses as the pine came around. And that's exactly the kind of disturbance regime that young oak likes relative to its competition. It's more fire-sensitive competition of some of the more shade-tolerant hardwoods. And with low deer browse and its ability to sprout back after fire, it really did promote underneath the pine that was mostly cut out again during the peak of Industrial Revolution, when cardboard boxes had not been invented, and pine was a very, very important packaging wood. Most of that pine was removed, heavily cut, and of course it was perfect for the release of all this oak-dominated, fire-tolerant, low sort of populated deer sort of habitat that oak could usurp during the early phases of the 1900s. And today's oak faces a very, very different circumstance. This is the third generation forest. When you think about it, second generation of oak, third generation forest, if you're including the old-field pine that we're facing today. It's all mostly about 100 years, plus or minus 20, 30 years on either side of this land use. And we face a very different circumstance. We face relatively high deer populations, though I might say, at least at the Yale-Myers Forest, deer populations have come back actually to something which is more normal. With we have a high number of predators now, black bear, bobcat, and coyote, or much larger coyote. There's an element of coy wolves apparently in our population that is definitely regulating the younger fawns. So we don't have such a high deer population. But historically, at least in the recent past, we have. We have no fire, and we have, because we have no fire, we have a lot more shade-tolerant hardwoods that are competing with our canopy oak trees. And we also have very large oak, which have a much greater sort of reduction in the propensity to sprout. If you look at, and there's a lot of sort of allometric and nice, strong sort of studies showing the relationship between the propensity of oak to sprout and their diameter. The smaller the diameter of the tree, the greater the ability for oak to sprout. And of course, most of all our oak, being one generation, being old, being in the canopy, being shade intolerant, but being up in the top of the canopy, when you cut it, doesn't have a great capacity to sprout. So it's that generation of trees, the second growth mixed hardwood, that gave rise to our understanding of stand dynamics. Studies by Oliver in the 1970s, Matt Kelty in the 1980s, Dave Kittredge in the 1980s, Bob Seymour, all these folks were doing pioneering work on looking at stratified mixtures. And it's the classic study in the Yale School of Forestry Environmental Studies Bulletin, Chad Oliver's work, 1978, really an idea that was facilitated by Dr. David Smith, about saying, well, you know, all these second growth mixed oak forests, mixed hardwood oak forests, they're stratified. But we know, in terms of their history, they're relatively even-aged. They all popped up after old-field pine, after cut-over old-field pine. How so? Why do we see the oak in the canopy and we have various other mixtures in there, but they tend to be in the subcanopy at different levels? And he looked at the classic work of Paul Richards, who was doing a lot of tropical work in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and he noticed, all those really detailed sort of lollipop diagrams of the stratification processes of those rainforests. And he thought, wow, these second growth oak forests, these second growth forests in New England seem to have a similar kind of stratification. But they're posing the fact that the stratification is sort of all-aged. And yet we know the stratification here is even-aged. And that's what got the early paradigm of stand dynamics going. And now, of course, I think for many of you, or most of you, you are brought up on that paradigm of stand dynamics, of initiation, stem exclusion, understory initiation, and old growth that was developed early on by the likes of people like Oliver and Kelty when they started dissecting through cutting up, sectioning trees, intimate mixtures of trees, going up so they could see at what age trees were relative to their competitors in terms of their height. And this is what you're looking at right here. This is a stem analysis of one of the plots of Oliver's at Yale Myers Forest in northeastern Connecticut. And here is a nice example of how these trees, the second growth forest, this sort of coppice seedling undergrowth beneath the pine, arose over time. And you can see this one is a good example of what would be defined as gradual divergence, one in which the red maple and the black birch were, if not just ahead of the northern red oak, keeping up with it for at least the first 15, 20 years. And then after that, gradually slowing down, diverging, and falling into or falling back into the subcanopy. And so when we look at these second growth forests, these stratified second growth forests, and this is a classic mixture, hardwood mixture, red oak is in the canopy, and then the black birch and the red maple of the same vintage, same age, is in the subcanopy. And there are all sorts of actual mixtures. Another one is an example with Mac Kelty's work. He worked both at Yale Myers, at Great Mountain Forest in northwestern Connecticut, and at Harvard Forest. And he, again, working with David Smith, showed another example of this developmental pattern, but a slight twist. In this circumstance, the red oak and the cherry sort of moved up in the canopy, cherry being a sort of an element more perhaps of the northern hardwood from the Berkshires, from the Great Mountain Forest, and remained so almost from the get-go as compared to hemlock, which was a slow-growing species, and you have what would be defined as more of an abrupt divergence. So these stratified mixtures can arise in a general sense in the same way, but they have different growth strategies. One strategy being perhaps a more gradual divergence, and another being one which is more abrupt. Nevertheless, these mixtures are stratified, they're even-aged. And it's always a case of the shade intolerance, the red oak, the black cherry, and if you look at other mixtures, if you go to more mesic sites, it would be red oak with, it could be in our region here in southern New England, tulip poplar, or red oak and white ash as you go further north, being the shade intolerance in the canopy, and then elements that would be in the subcanopy could be sugar maple on some of the sweeter sites, or beech in some of the more acidic sites. And in some of the drier sites here in New England, we can have the sort of the subcanopy hickory, particularly the pignut hickory, or the Mockernut hickory in these circumstances, behaving in a similar manner. They're a little bit more shade tolerant than the oak. So there is a very long-running story of the nature of stratification and our knowledge base of how these second growth forests originated. There's also a bunch of information that we know about these kinds of forests. We know that they're heavily dominated by masting species. That would be originally the chestnut, that would have the same kind of horticological characteristics as the oak. It's a shade intolerant. It would be out in the canopy, particularly on drier sites. It was a super dominant. The beech, the hickories, all the oaks, they have infrequent masting. We also know that these forests, for their future development, rely upon advanced growth. All these shade-intolerant canopy trees and all the shade-tolerant below canopy species rely upon some kind of advanced growth, seedlings or saplings, and actually existing in the understory for some kind of release disturbance. They're adapted to a variety of light conditions in the understory. And they have limited upward growth. They're just sort of sitting there. Some might grow a little faster, some might grow or have a little bit more persistence in the understory. Many of the more shade-intolerant species, such as the oaks and the hickories, have a significant ability to die back and re-sprout. And those shade-intolerant species, relative to the shade-tolerant, have a poor ability to survive. So we know all that. It's a sort of a persistence strategy. It's a strategy of building up in different levels and then waiting in a relatively conservative way for a disturbance that will then allow them to release into the next generation of trees. Okay. Now, what we don't know is their relative differences in persistence. How does this change in relation to topography? We don't know the competitive interactions between species very well. How does black birch interact with, and sugar maple interact with the oaks? Under what site circumstances? Moisture, nutrition. And what is the frequency of these mastings? We say 3 to 5 years, but actually that's sort of a lot of hearsay. We just sort of observe, but we don't really record systematically. And even if it's a mast year, do those seeds actually germinate and survive? Every time there's a big blanket of seeds, okay, what happens to them? We assume that they all germinate. Now, these are all sort of the unknown questions of advancing what we do know, particularly in relation to how we can manage them, how we can manage these forests into the future. Now, there's been a lot of other work in similar forest types, these oak mixtures, second growth oak mixtures, particularly not so much from second growth from pasture, but second growth that is from cutover forests in the central Appalachians, with Brocy and Van Leer. They've examined the role of fire and the promotion of fire to try and advance oak as compared to the more shade-tolerant competitors in these second growth forests for the third generation. And then if you look at the early work of Loftus, U.S. Forest Service in the southern Appalachians, this would be, so the central Appalachians, I'm talking about sort of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Northern Virginia. And then if you're thinking about the work that Loftus did, he's really talking about sort of the borderlands of the southern Appalachians with the Coweta Experimental Forest Research Station, the work done at the Bent Creek Forest Research Station in western North Carolina, for example, and on the other side in eastern Tennessee. There they experimented with herbicide rather than fire. And they were looking at trying to take out the competitors of oak in understories through the use of herbicides as compared to the use of fire. And as you can see, there's an advantage to doing either or. If you can work with fire is probably an easier process to work with in terms of a prescribed burn than individual stem injection of small diameter competition with oak that is existing or persisting in the understory. And then sort of a little bit of a deviation from that are the bottomland hardwood systems of the Mississippi, where Oliver and his colleagues down in the Mississippi bottomlands of the river valleys there looked at very heavy cutting and the role that plays in the release of these very shade tolerant, persistent or relatively persistent oaks, very different group of oaks. This is the cherry bark oaks, the Nuttall's oaks, very complex oaks that are in competition with a whole group of more shade tolerant hardwoods, unrelated to the kinds of hardwoods that we have up here. Halesia is an example of a species that would be in competition. Some of the shade tolerant elms. Okay, so what do we know about New England and what do we know about southern New England? How can we advance with that literature in those regions work that we can do here? We know that disturbance in particularly the southern New England region, which is impacted by hurricanes coming off the Atlantic Ocean, coming off hurricanes that feed off sort of periodically the eastern seaboard, we know that those are probably the biggest release type disturbances that occur once every 100 years, is what David Foster and folks at the Harvard Forest have modeled, which is actually, when you think about it, pretty consistent with the kinds of growth rates and maturation rates of these kinds of oak, second growth oak forests. And this is an example. Tornadoes as well. Tornadoes, we just had a tornado just a few years ago, just north of our own forest, and this is a picture of a tornado 40 miles in length, about 1 mile to half a mile in breadth. And then, of course, ice storms and strong convectional windstorms. Convectional windstorms occurring when frontal systems come across, particularly in the deep summertime, when you have these very strong downbursts. They can create hectares worth, 100 to hectares and less, windstorms across our forests here, at least in southern New England. And they don't look too different in many cases to something much larger like this tornado or hurricane. These are the kinds of releasing disturbances that are going to promote the release of those shade tolerance. And we've been following these kinds of natural disturbances to verify this. And this is exactly what seems to be the case. This is exactly what happened. You're looking at a picture of a tornado just north of the Yale Myers Forest, in which it now looks an extremely complex young stem exclusion stand, only 5 years, 6 years old, with a lot of oak sprout, a lot of oak, maple, a mixture of both shade tolerant and shade intolerant species in there. So we know disturbance plays a big role. We know dramatic disturbance plays a big role. We don't really know how that kind of disturbance interacts with topography. We just don't have the data to look at how, for example, hurricanes really are influencing or influenced by topography. There's some data to show that these kinds of convectional windstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes are greatly influenced topography. As you can imagine, you'd think that the more mesic, inundated sites are much more sensitive to wind throw through tip-up mounds because they are essentially unstable. Their root systems are flat. They're governed by where the water table is, and if they can't sink their root systems into the soil because of a close to surface water table, they're much more sensitive because of their canopies to tip up, particularly during the leaf-on stage, if a windstorm comes on before the leaf-off stage. And as you go up slope, they become, with deeper tap roots, those species, those oaks in particular, for example, rather than the lateral rooting species like beech and sugar maple and hemlock, become much more stable in those environments. And so they tend to actually, even though they might have larger crowns, and this has been proven by, again, Harvard Forests, they did a simulated hurricane pullover, and they couldn't pull over those very large oak trees. They could pull over all sorts of smaller lateral rooting subcanopy trees, but not the largest trees, much more stable on the drier sites. So there's a sort of a good example of what nature is telling you about differential kinds of disturbance. They're all dramatic, sort of moving across the site. Different levels of, for example, cutting in terms of sort of a very heavy impact, one cut shell to it, if you want to think of it that way, on the lower lying topography, and as you go up slope, you can get away with or imitate more structure, masting, seed source on the upper slopes. We'll come back to that. However, what goes on in the understory in terms of persistence? Here is a nice transect of the classic kinds of rolling topography that we have here in southern New England, sort of the up and down metamorphic underlying bedrock, extremely ancient, but with young glacial, superficial glacial till soils on primarily all of them except for the lower lying outwash. And it's those till soils upon which most of our second growth oak, most of our second growth hardwood forests dominate, with different kinds of these trajectories, growth mixtures between hemlock, between black birch, between sugar maple, beech. On the more mesic sites, we might have more beech, more sugar maple, might have hemlock as a legacy of a different kind of land use, and on the more sort of mid-slope sites, more red maple. On the drier sites, some of the drier hardwoods, dry site hardwoods. No matter what, oak tends to be found across all those till soils. So does hickory. It tends to speciate out. We tend to have black oak, scarlet oak on the drier sites, and we can even get down onto the floodplain soils, pin oak. And red oak tends to dominate on all soils, but predominate best on the moderate slopes, the deep till soils, which are more mesic or nicely drained. So that begs the question, first of all, how does oak persist, different species of oak, relative to their competitors in the understory? If we're trying to regenerate these stands on different sites, how does oak persist relative to the understory on these different sites? We've done a whole bunch, and we still continue to monitor. We're now, well, coming up to close to 30 years worth of documentation of monitoring the cohort dynamics of regeneration across topography at the Yale-Myers Forest. Starting in 1990, we put in plots in the forest understory of all these second growth oak forests on valley, mid-slope, and ridge till soils, and we've been recording the survival, the differential survival of different advanced regeneration species. We all know they persist, but for how long? And how do they persist relative to each other? And here's a nice example. You can see that on ridge sites, that's the top diagram. Up here you can see my arrow. You can see on ridge sites, different species over time, if you're looking at their mean survival over time, this is years on this axis here, this is the percent survival. What you can see are the black squares or rectangular boxes, that is red oak, and the sort of asterisk signs, that is white oak. on the ridges, they can survive 20% of the population, which for oak, that's actually quite a lot of individuals. Yes, there might be quite a bit of death over time, but over 20 years, they're still surviving, 20%. So you might have thousands of oak after a mast year, and you still have 20% of those oak surviving over a 20-year time frame. Who'd have known that all that advanced generation, you can dig up that oak and you can actually look at the cohort. We've been monitoring the biggest cohort at our forest, the biggest cohort in our forest, established in one unique year in 1993. And it's still there. It's still the largest proportion of advanced generation on our forest floor. Now that is a really new finding. We always think about oak being replenished much more frequently because our mast years are every 3 to 5 years. But they actually don't establish very well. So that was a big surprise to us. We are reliant upon mast years that are a lot more infrequent if we're looking at persistence in the understory of oak for the regeneration of our forests. And that they have very different persistence levels on very different sites. If you look at the valley, okay, you can see that we're down to 0. And we're down to 0 in terms of oak. We don't have any white oak on the valley sites, these deep till soils, but we're down within 10 years, down to almost 0, dead. And our white oak, non-existent. So what you're looking at here is something that is a unique finding in many ways, is the differential levels of persistence that we have in between these species. You can see that the sugar maple on the valley sites has a much higher survival. Yeah, relatively speaking, they all die, or a great proportion die, but when you're looking at sugar maple, those are the triangles, we have about 20% of the sugar maple surviving after 15 years. And if you look at the rich sites, what sugar maple there is the seed stores is dead almost immediately. Okay, so, and that's the same with the ash story. So this is a really unique finding. Persistence really changes, and it really is a very important thing to think about how you develop shelterwoods in very different ways. You, in ridges, on ridge sites, can be a lot more conservative. You already have the regeneration, it builds up, you can hold it for a long period of time. The white oak, relative to shade intolerance, and shade tolerance rather, which are more sort of drought prone. And on the valley sites, you have to be a lot more opportunistic. Here's another example of oak and relative to their competitors, sugar maple and white ash, on the two different sites. When you're looking at the valley, sugar maple and white ash have superior growth characteristics. You can see that they have incremental growth. They're able to establish, and if you look at what you're looking at here is, this is red maple. The growth of red maple is able to establish and move along on, you can see these are actually the physical mean growth. And then if you're looking at white ash, similarly, these black circles, and this is the regression line for the mean sort of oak, the white ash growth on mesic valleys. You can see the regression line for sugar maple continuing to grow. So after 17 years, they're about, and they're 17-year-old, they're about 45 centimeters. So they are plodding along in those understories, sort of waiting for a disturbance. But if you look at oak, the growth is actually dead. Those are the black circles that you're looking at here. And so, and the same with the red maple. The red maple actually dies on those circumstances on mesic sites. But if you look at the oak growth on ridge sites, the sugar maple is dying, the white ash is dying, The red maple is even dying, as defined by the species that are falling off after 4 years, 9 years, and 10 years. But what you can see here is that the white oak is growing relatively nicely, not so well on valley sites as sugar maple, which is 45 centimeters after 6 years. After 16 years, the white oak is about 40 centimeters after almost 20 years, and the red oak is actually much slower growing, relatively speaking, to white oak. It's surviving nicely, but after 20 years, it's only about 20 centimeters. So they're really small, but they are growing. Okay, so that's a neat finding. So what's happening post understory? What happens with release? We know there's different levels of persistence, and it relates to topography, and species sort of fall in line, they interact. Different species have different shade tolerances, different species have different drought tolerances that are really affecting their growth in different topographic positions. And it takes a long time, 20 years. We can see that these differences are sorting themselves out. But if you're trying to do a shelterwood, how can you release that regeneration that is persisting in the ground, and how can you prefer certain groups of species over others? So what we did in southern New England is we had these experimental linear gaps. Now, these are not silvicultural systems in and of themselves. They are testing a variety of silvicultural systems that correspond to lethal site treatments and non-lethal or release site treatments, and a complete range of light regimes. That's what we call them. We call them experimental linear gaps. They are arranged east-west. The length of these gaps is east-west. The breadth is north-south. And they're on different sites, ridge sites, mid-slope sites, valley sites, different soil types. So we can compare the growth of seedlings growing in the southern understory. See where my arrow is sort of circling, to seedlings growing at the southern edge, to seedlings growing on the interior gap side of the southern edge, to the center of the gap, to the northern edge, to the interior. This is an incredibly good, neat experiment, in my opinion, because you can see how release type disturbances work relative to the species that are persisting in the understory, advanced generation, as to species that come in post-disturbance and establish with that advanced generation across different light regimes. And it's replicated. See, look at my arrow here. It's replicated because our gaps aren't circular like most silvicultural systems, like selection systems or shelterwoods, which are all patchy. We can replicate the edge effect. So we can essentially put different treatments up and down all the way across this and replicate. So we can have release treatments here where we don't do anything to the ground story. We release the advanced generation and see what comes in after competing with the advanced generation. And we can do it there, we can do it here, and we can do it there, for example. And at the same time, right adjacent, we can eradicate that advanced generation and see what happens in the understory in the northern edge, in the northern edge itself, in the center, in the southern edge. And we can do that replication. We can just have a very long experimental linear gap, and we can replicate the site treatment of lethal versus release to find out, wow, what are the competitive dynamics between different kinds of disturbance regimes for different kinds of light regimes. So if you think about it, every single kind of silvicultural manipulation is observed in this ELG in a replicated fashion. And we can do this on different sites. So that's what we did. And just to summarize, here are some of the competitive relationships in release. Obviously, when you eradicate advanced generation, no oak. Doesn't come in very well. And so what's really important is if you have oak, And you're looking at the southern understory, southern edge, gap center, northern edge, northern understory. What happens when it regenerates and is released, and how it competes with the shade tolerance? And you can see that it competes very effectively on the drier sites, particularly when in the lighter, brighter light regimes, in the gap center relative to black birch, and in the northern edge, and even in the northern understory. Red oak has a superior height growth as compared to black birch. But as soon as you get into the shade, even on the ridge sites, black birch can have a superior growth relative to northern red oak. And then likewise, on the flatter sites where you can have bright light regimes, you can have, if you have very large openings on the northern edge and the gap center, red oak supersedes its most competitive species, black birch. But on mid-slope sites, and I'm going to put a caveat here, these are northern slope mid-slope sites. So these are mesic sites, water is running down, subsurface water flow, well-drained, deep-till soils, but on the shaded side of on the northern aspects, you can see that though there is red oak grows, relatively speaking, only in these gap centers, but it still cannot compete with the black birch. That tells us a lot, relatively speaking, about the competitive dynamic between shade tolerance and shade intolerance, and how we need to think about different treatments if we're going to release the shade intolerance. And this is probably, we've talked about oak here, but it's probably related to ash on the mesic sites, where ash grows well, if you want ash. If you want tulip poplar, relatively speaking, in southern New England, it might be tulip poplar on those sites. Tulip poplar acts as a much greater competitor with oak further to our south, excuse me, but not in New England. And then, of course, if you go further up, this could be the similar with hickory. Hickory is, relatively speaking, I mentioned hickory is more shade tolerant than oak, but it's less shade tolerant than some of the other more shade tolerant species like black birch or the maples. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, for the last 25 years, we've been experimentally working in tandem with these experimental treatments that we've just talked about in the understory and in these experimental linear gaps, sort of pre-disturbance understandings of advanced generation and cohort dynamics and post-disturbance release effects. We've been also testing this out through shelterwoods or seed tree systems or selection systems across our forest, our 7,860 acre forest. We have about 35 stands in which we treated now different kinds of cuttings on different aspects and on different slopes and different slope positions. And so what we find across our Yale Mars forest, and it's the red and the darker black that is depicting our different kinds of shelterwood systems, what we find is, yes, you have to be pretty dramatic, and that the nature of being dramatic changes relative to topographic position. As you can imagine, on the valley sites, we can secure oak regeneration, and it's competitive if you really open up those stands. And you open them up when you have to be opportunistic. Opportunistic when that mass crop occurs, because it doesn't persist very long. So you have to be opportunistic and you have to be dramatic to favor the oak, the more shade intolerance, over the more shade tolerant subcanopy, which tends to have a much greater propensity, because it's a more mesic environment, more mesic soil type. You have sugar maples, which you want in those stands. Don't get me wrong, you want them, but they're competitively at a much greater advantage. You're going to have beech in those sites. We don't have a beech problem in our forest, which I'm sure you'll be rolling your eyes for those of you up in northern New England, saying, "Oh my goodness, how lucky." And so we can't really tell you so much about beech as a competitor with oak. We have some ideas, but we also have black birch. So you have to be dramatic and opportunistic with mass crops. That's the big theme there. And then as you go upslope, you can be less dramatic. You can hold on to more structure. You can be more conservative. You don't need to worry about being so opportunistic, because the persistence of the oak regeneration and the hickory regeneration too, it's the same story, can hang around for a longer period of time. But mid-slope sites, yes, you can hold on to more structure, but you will have to deal with black birch competition. And that means you have to work with some kind of release treatment, some kind of cleaning, where you purposely go in about 5 years, and we're actually studying this right now, what kind of release treatment is the best. I can't tell you what kind of release treatment right now is the best, but we have a series of shelterwoods on different sites where we're testing this out to find out, particularly on these sensitive mid-slope sites, at what time we should go in to release oak from black birch. But we know we have to do that. How many oak do we need to release per hectare or per acre? It's another thing that we need to find out. But we do know we need to do it. Just to give you an example of some of these experiments that we're doing right now, we have release treatments at about 5 years on these kinds of sites, where we've gone in with a brush cutter and done 2-meter clearings around oak from black birch and associated red maple sprout of origin. And then we've also gone into young stem. That's basically what we define as sort of still initiation stage. Canopy closure hasn't occurred at 5 years. But we've also gone in and done the same thing when the oak is now overtopped by the black birch or red maple sprouts, and this is around 15 years, and we have taken and girdled or cut down stems in around 2-meter radius, the biggest overtopping competitors for each quarter of a circle, the nearest competitors to these sub-canopy oak. And of course we have controls. We haven't done that. We're monitoring what is the best time, what stage is the best time. Can we do that post stem exclusion or just during stem exclusion, or do we have to do it during the initiation phase to secure that oak to come through on these more sort of mid-slope northern aspect sites? By the way, I say northern aspect because on southern aspect, these are drier sites. They are also much hotter, sunnier sites, and therefore the ridge type topography moves down to a much sort of is a sort of, that ridge sort of effect moves down the mid-slope to a much greater degree. And so you can get away with holding on to canopy structure or longer persistence, and you don't need to do these kinds of release treatments on southern aspects to at least to the degree that you have to do it on northern aspects. Okay, so this comes to some of the manuals that we've been developing in northeastern Connecticut, in which, if you're looking at valley to ridge sites, they are sort of a gradation between seed tree in which you can hold on to reserves, irregular seed tree if you want, but they are very far apart spacings, 60 to 70 feet apart, and these trees of course are large. They're more productive sites, but the oaks grow at a much more rapid rate. We find that the rotation there for oak on our sites is around 80 years. The spacing we can hold on to very large trees, 20 inches and above, for about 10 years, but we have to be dramatically more opportunistic and much more dramatic in terms of the cut to release species. And if we're going to hold on to sort of slower growing sub-canopy sugar maple, hemlock, beech of the same vintage as those canopy oak, the best way to do that is to minimize edge effect. And the way we do that is to hold them into groups. If you put them in group reserves, if you want those, for other kinds of structural attributes, for wildlife habitat, or for masting, or for some economic value, if you want to hold on to a sugar maple in particular, that why would you cut a 10-inch sugar maple, which is going to potentially be a veneer, or it could be a sugar bush for the future. You would try and cluster them so you minimize edge effect. Okay, but as you move up slope, you can hold on to more structure. They become more like a sheltwood, and after regenerating, yes, you can take off the parent trees, but you can hold on to more reserves if you're doing irregular shelterwoods. And they don't need to be grouped. They can be single tree reserves. As you can imagine, as you go up slope, the shade tolerant sort of move out of those systems, that the mesic loving species move out of that system, and so you can hold on to single tree reserves that are perhaps some of the smaller oaks, some of the smaller hickory, that might have financial value later on, post regeneration. Or if you're looking at trying to hold on to some kind of canopy as a mass source for some sort of wildlife habitat value or aesthetic value that you might have. So these are the kinds of constraints you can work with. And I say acute to chronic because you can actually sort of more gradually remove the canopy and still get away with the release effect of the understory, because there is there's less shade tolerant competition effect. The light regimes are already brighter. The persistence of the oak and also the hickory, though I'm not talking so much about hickory in this talk, to exist is more robust, and so you can release them. Now that's not to say that if you just basically do a one-cut shelterwood there and get away with it, you can. But if you are trying to regenerate and you're looking at more aesthetic constraints, or you're looking at more habitat constraints in terms of retaining more structure, or there is a whole bunch of smaller trees that have economic value that you want to carry forth into the next rotation in terms of age class, yes, you can do that. You're not constrained with that more shade intolerant advanced generation that is competing with the more shade tolerant. And so it provides, as you go upslope, you have much greater flexibility with the regeneration method that you can hold forth. So here is sort of conceptually the approach that you can work with. If you're working with a stand, these boxes represent stands. And you're looking at valley, mid-slope, and ridge sites, and the carrying capacity of the overstory relative to the regeneration method that you're using. And blue represents regeneration, or the open areas. And if you're working with an episodic regeneration method in which you want to carry on other age classes, 1 or 2 age classes, so that would be a multi-age system, but with one dominant cohort, a young regeneration age class, you'd be working with seed tree or shelterwoods. Okay, and so the matrix is regeneration. And if you look at the top left, okay, the one I've got circled, if you're looking at the valley, you have to be very dramatic. You're leaving a few you can see the crown size of these orange canopied trees. These are the residual canopy trees. Those are the oaks. In some cases, they might be some of the very large, in our forest type, sugar maple or ash as well. But these are the large canopy trees that you retain. They are the seed trees. This is almost a seed tree system at the valley. and you leave them at a wide spacing, and then you can leave structure, but you're grouping the structure with the parent overstory trees, the residual trees that you leave behind, or in groups alone. Far spacing. And you do it at a time, an opportunity, when you've got that shade-tolerant, intolerant regeneration established. Bam. And then you can get away with it. But as you go up slope, you don't have so much competition. You can hold on to reserves that can be individuals or grouped. The crown sizes are actually smaller. The stature of the trees are smaller. The site index is smaller. So you can get away with a closer spacing. Still, you've got a regeneration matrix, and it's in these sites, after you remove the orange trees, that you leave the reserves behind if you want an irregular age class. Those are the green trees. Those might be the shade tolerance. It's not to say you can't leave some of the orange trees behind too. You can. But you've got to be very careful about releasing the regeneration in those in the understory. And that's where you have to do the release treatments. And then if you go up to the ridge, you can hold on. These are still shelterwoods. You're probably going to, if you want to have irregular shelterwoods, you might remove 3/4 to half the orange trees after you've established after your establishment cut, and you leave the green trees, or the more shade tolerant. That might be the little bit more of the hickories or the red maples or whatever you're leaving behind for structural wildlife habitat. And you can get away with it. More structure. Okay, that's the episodic multi-age system for regenerating, and it's probably the more sort of conservative way of working with the edge effect for promoting the shade intolerant second growth hardwoods, which we find so difficult to regenerate in the third generation forest. But you could probably work with selection systems. But I'm going to tell you, you need to be dramatic. And if you're going to work on valley sites with selection systems, they're almost like big patch cuts. 1 acre, sometimes 2 acres. You're trying to reduce their edge effect. And they have to be opportunistic, because they really are inverted to this, to the valley irregular seed tree systems. You're trying to create a seed tree regeneration method with confined, with a maximum effect, but minimizing the edge effect. Okay, and as you go up slope, you can get away with smaller gap sizes, but they're really still mid-slope. They are patch size, and as you go up to ridge sites, you might get away with single tree selection, but I'm going to suggest to you it's better to work with group selection systems in these drier sites. And in those circumstances, you can get away with it because the understory shade intolerance matrix is more persistent, and you do not have that competition. So here are some examples, okay, of what you can do in terms of leaving structure behind. You can work with all sorts of reserves, all sorts of structures, both from an economic perspective, if you want to. There's no point cutting smaller diameter trees, sugar maple, red oak, if they're of economic value for the future. And in most circumstances, most landowners, particularly in terms of private landowners who are interested in wildlife, you're interested in leaving reserve structures in shelterwoods, irregular shelterwoods or irregular seed trees, or through selection systems where you leave structures in the middle of your big patch cuts that relate to various kinds of habitats. This can all be done. We haven't really quantified these phenomena. We've heard a lot about them. We've heard a lot about them, their values. But actually, if you look at the literature, there's not much literature really demonstrating the quantitative value, and that's what we're actually looking at right now. But here's some examples of an irregular seed tree at Yale Myers on a valley toe slope. And you can see the advanced generation. Yes, this is what it looks like. It's tiny. It's 20 years old, if we have it. And this is where we work with opportunity. And this is a nice, neat thing to think about. Yes, advanced generation in the understory establishes and persists, and there's quite a bit of it after 20 years. But you can actually be, as soon, whenever you have these 3 to 5 year old masting periods, you can use those, particularly if you cut at the same time as you have that mast year, because they might not, we know they don't establish in the understory in many circumstances, but they do establish when you do these dramatic treatments. There is a much greater dramatic establishment of shade intolerant masts during a mast year from those 3 to 5. They don't establish, and as I mentioned that, they do not necessarily establish in the understories if you don't treat. So be aware of that. And as you go, oh, by the way, and this is what it looks like if you're trying to hold on to and do a patch selection. You can leave some structure, but not much. And you really have to hammer the understory. This is laurel in our forest, in which we've crushed the laurel to really establish the advanced generation that is already there. It's persisting. And then if we, with a mast year, we can add a little bit more, supplement it, and in those circumstances, you can get away. It's almost like a sea tree or a sort of a very distant shelterwood. But as you go upslope, you can hold on to more structure. This is where you need cleanings. You can see there's a lot more structure there. I've tried, this is not such a great photograph, but this is meant to be my effort at a pan-tropical example of a 14-acre shelterwood in which we've left quite a bit of structure with a lot of subcanopy. And in the understory, we still crush the laurel. You can see the oak relative to the laurel in brighter light regimes. And then if you go up to the ridge sites, we hold on to a lot more subcanopy. And this is actually at treatment and then post-treatment after about 5 years. Vigorously growing and growing up. And we can hold on to, continue to hold on to, quite a lot of subcanopy in these irregular shelterwoods. So that's the story. I'm just going to follow up, because what we're doing now is, I've alluded to some of the post-establishment release treatments we're following up on, but we're also doing a lot of wildlife research in these shelterwoods. And this is a good example. This is some of the wildlife work from the most recent work in our forest ecology and management paper of looking at shelterwoods as related to mature. These are the original second growth forest. You can see my arrow here of the mature second growth forest, relative shelterwoods of different successional stage. Early initiation, that's really between 0 to 7 years in age class. Late initiation, the triangles, which relate to 7 to 14 years in age class. The crown canopies really close around 12 years. And then early stem exclusion, 14 to 20 years in age class in terms of shelterwood development. And what you can see is, if we're looking at breeding birds as one taxa, huge organismal taxa of diversity in our habitats, in our regeneration methods, you can see that the bird diversity, the breeding bird diversity, is significantly above. This is the number of plots that we have, and then it's significantly above in the early shelterwoods, species richness, as measured by species richness, and then gradually declines as the shelterwoods develop to the mature forest. That's pretty neat. You can also see this is sort of an analysis variance of species richness of various kinds and abundance, different kinds of diversity measures. You can see that A means they have significantly greater diversity in early initiation. Okay, if you look at early initiation, 1 to 7 years, 2 as compared to the mature forest, and it gradually declines, and it's within 20 years that this. So it's a very dramatic, and as you'd expect, you know, you're all foresters, it's a very dramatic habitat change. So it's an ephemeral one. And if you're trying to maintain early initiation, you have to be sort of creating this shifting mosaic of shelterwoods across your stands, representing different age classes. Because by early stem exclusion, it's moving back into structure and habitat. So within 14 to 20 years, it's already moving into a habitat of interior forest habitat. So when we're talking about interior forest, ground nesting birds, and here is a great example, the difference between shrub nesting and ground nesting birds, and this is a linear regression. Look at this. As an indication, time since harvest of shelterwoods, what you can see is within, well, first of all, we actually have a relative abundance. The ground nesting birds are very sensitive to predation. These are the oven birds, the hermit thrushes, the Swainson thrushes. These are the birds that are reflective of interior nesting habitat. What's really neat is within 7 years, there's actually not much significant difference between interior forest habitat. In fact, there's no significant difference between interior forest habitat and those initiating shelterwood systems. And they gradually, as you can see, significantly increase. It's a significant effect. And the shrub nesting, that's what really is adding to the diversity of those breeding birds. The shrub nesting birds, these are the yellow warblers, the chestnut-sided warblers, the eastern towies. These are relatively rare birds in our interior second growth hardwood stands now. Dramatically increase. In the first 5, 10 years, they have much higher significant populations as compared to within sort of shelterwoods, which move back into interior nesting habitat. So this is a very nice dramatic effect of how different functional groups move through the stand dynamic phase, all within 20 years of these shelterwoods. And we're really trying to add to that. So with our findings, in concluding remarks, I think I'm 10 minutes over, but anyway, maybe. But you all know I have a propensity to talk. With concluding remarks, I hope that illustrates, that we have some of the similar findings of work done in the Middle Appalachians and the Southern Appalachians of the necessity of working with shade tolerance and fighting against shade tolerance in certain localities, certain sites, particularly with black birch. As to what they find in the Southern Appalachians and Central Appalachians, their bête noire, their competitive shade tolerant, is tulip poplar. There, they find, particularly in most sites, they have to fight against tulip poplar through fire or herbicide. For us, we find we only have to fight against shade tolerance on certain sites, and we have to be more opportunistic on certain sites. On other sites, we can be more conservative. And on the mid-slope northern aspect sites, we can be a little bit more conservative, but it's there that we have to dramatically fight, and particularly with release treatments. And that's where we're experimentally trying to figure out, well, we might not have to do such dramatic release treatments, just fighting the competition around select oak, perhaps. Okay, so that's an interesting phenomena. We're continuing to work on a series of advances. We realize that bird diversity is actually a huge plus in these kinds of shelterwood and patch selection type successional systems. We're looking to try and say, okay, well, what kind of structure does it really reflect? We want to try and quantify the ecological value of holding on to structure. That's going to be really important. We also want to try and work with other kinds of structural wildlife taxa. How does this affect amphibians? This is a big one, particularly in how can we do shelterwoods adjacent to vernal pools, for example? How does it affect wetland species or wetland-dependent species? How fast do various kinds of amphibians move back into interior kinds of habitats of shelterwoods or selection systems? So we're working with that, stay tuned, and we're also working with the kinds of values. You know, what's the economic value of holding on to reserves, particularly because many of these reserves in shelterwoods might have strong financial values, given interest rates, return of interest, they might have much stronger growth release effects. Yes, we're trying to release regeneration, but we're also releasing the overstory. If we're going to leave sort of relatively small diameter, really nice formed oak or sugar maple, what is the expected financial return of leaving those that will be eventually come perhaps veneer? So that's what we're doing in terms of our future research. So I'm going to acknowledge a lot of my colleagues now who are my past students, my collaborators at various universities now. And I also want to acknowledge a lot of the publications that are going on, that we've been doing at the Yale Myers Forest on these various kinds of shelterwoods. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for joining us this morning and sharing not only the story of oak, but also all of your research on managing it. We'll have to have you back as your research continues. This is an opportunity if folks have questions. We can hang on for a minute or two here, but before folks head off this morning, just a few quick reminders about the series. As I mentioned in the introduction, if you want to get continuing education credits, there will be a survey at the end of the webinar. Please follow the link to take the survey. There'll also be a survey that'll be emailed out as a follow-up email in case you don't have time to complete it online this morning. Also, just a quick last announcement and reminder, due to some scheduling challenges, we actually have a bonus webinar this month. So our next webinar will actually be on February 15th, and we'll be continuing the silvicultural theme with a webinar studying this or looking at the story of American beech, which we discussed a little bit this morning. So stay tuned for an announcement and a link for registration for that upcoming webinar. Again, that webinar will be on February 15th at the same time, 9:30 in the morning. Stay tuned for an announcement and a registration link. So Mark, I don't see any questions coming in, but if folks have any questions, please feel free to send them in. We'll take a few minutes. Otherwise, have a great day, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning.
No more questions?
You must have covered it all. I don't see any questions coming in.
Okay.
So
well,
with
thank you very much,
you. Yeah, thank you again, Mark, for your time this morning, and thank you everybody for participating. Have a good day, all.
Bye-bye. Hey, Jess, you can come in, sorry.